This is our final lecture on Avicenna. I called this 4B. We've had then 4 of these shorter lectures on Avicenna so far. So let's proceed. So our focus now is on Avicenna Metaphysics, Book 9. That's the final texts of Avicenna's Metaphysics I want to look at today. And particularly I want to look at chapters 1 and 4. Book 9 is on emanation from God and the return to God, and its title is On the Attribute of the Efficacy, or we could also translate it agency, fa'ilia, of the first principle. There's a lot of interest here, including a very interesting discussion at chapter 9, paragraph 11, on the necessity of the necessary existent and the rejection of the notion of will in the first cause. This is an excellent topic for a course paper, particularly in the context of the religious view of God having free will regarding his creating or his abstaining from creating the world. For our concerns here today, however, I want to focus on chapter 1, paragraphs 19 and following. These constitute a critique of the notion of creation in time. Another good topic for paper. He writes at the beginning of 19 as follows, quote, "Moreover, by what does the first precede his created acts? By his essence or by time? If only by his essence, as 1 is to 2, even though both are simultaneous, and as the movement of the thing in motion, in that it moves by the motion of that which moves it, even though both are simultaneous, then it follows necessarily that both are temporally originated, that is, the eternal first and the acts generated from him." So I want to pause just for a moment. Notice the stress here by Avicenna on simultaneity. This is quite important because, remember, for Avicenna, the first acts by its very being, or to use the Greek, auto to enai, the Arabic, bi aniyatihi. So as soon as the first is posited to exist immediately, not by any separate action, but immediately in virtue of its very essence, its acts occur from it. And of course, we've seen in the Platoniana Arabica and in Avicenna, the first act of the first is the creation of intellect, the first created being. And in Avicenna, there then follows a emanative hierarchy of beings, each created. Yes, remember, he wants to say that the word ibda properly describes not just the first moment of creation, but every instance of ex nihilo creation. And in the emanation of the hierarchy of intellects for Avicenna, constituting the universe and the immaterial entities moving these bodies in the heavens, for Avicenna then, each of those is creation ex nihilo. So Avicenna reasons, well then, shouldn't we say that creation ex nihilo is not limited just to the first? That's his own view on it. Well, we proceed. The issue here then is one of conceptual and real coherence. Was there a time before the creation of motion and time? And to this, paragraph 21, Avicenna responds, quote, "Now, if he did not precede by some past thing the first temporal moment of the origination of creation, then he would have come into being in time with its temporal coming to being. How, according to the things they had posited, would he not have preceded the first moment of creation by some state when he was and there was no creation, and then he was and there was creation?" So this is Avicenna's challenge to those who say that there is such a thing as temporal creation. And of course, you'll recall that for Aquinas, there is the notion then that the philosophers did have a notion of creation, but the philosophers did not think that it could be demonstrated that there was creation in time. Rather, that is something for faith. How exactly that is to be included in a metaphysics such as we see in Avicenna, where he rejects it, how can Aquinas look at that metaphysics, draw from it, and also put forward his own notion based on the faith that there is an origination of the world a finite number of years prior to the present? That's an interesting issue for a course paper. But we proceed. Oh, as I say here, it's an interesting for a course paper. Yes. However, the issue is an obvious one then. How does it make sense to say that there is anything but an eternal emanation from the first agent as the real nature of creation? Now let's turn to 9.4, that is Book 9, Chapter 4, for a final look at Avicenna on creation. In paragraph 11 in Book 9, Chapter 4, Avicenna provides an account of the necessary and the possible, which finds emanation as the installation of plurality in the world by God. We've seen this already. He then goes on in paragraph 12 at page 331, and note the precise page here, to assert that origination as ibda was reserved by the earlier tradition of the Platoniana Arabica and the Liber de Causas to God alone, as creation can appropriately be asserted in the description of the activity of the mediate intellects in the Avicennian emanative hierarchy. That is, Avicenna teaches mediate creation, though he also continues to hold a doctrine of primary causality, tracing every entity back to the first. That too is a good topic. We earlier considered a passage from Aquinas in his commentary on the sentences, Book 2, Distinction 1, Question 1, Article 2, where Aquinas spoke of creation involving two things. I'll quote the text here. The first is that it is from nothing presupposed. This negates what he calls the order of creation in the sense that it negates the possibility that there is actually existing in some way something from X which the created thing arises. I'm paraphrasing here. The second that Aquinas mentioned is that the non-existence of the created thing prior to creation continues to be evidenced in the notion that, quote, if the created thing is left to itself, non-being would result, for it has being only from the influence of a superior cause, because the thing created naturally has non-being prior to being. And of course we've seen this is coming from Avicenna, as we've seen earlier. Both of those considerations then we found in Avicenna, who particularly emphasized the denial of the ontological status to the non-existent, discussed in Islamic theology, and also employed in attempts at ordinary discourse about creation. So those who would criticize, I add here, those who would criticize Avicenna as a pantheist have not read the texts of Avicenna. He's very clear that he is not a pantheist. Furthermore, Avicenna is very clear about the nature of agent causality. We've seen that in the texts. Agent causality of the metaphysical kind, not the physical kind, is a creative causality that creates something outside of the agent. Avicenna was very, very careful to explain this. I mention this now because sometimes Thomistic critics have asserted that Avicenna was a pantheist or had difficulty distinguishing the first from other things, and that's just not correct. I carry on then. So we have also seen Avicenna reason at length, well, I guess I just said the same thing, didn't I? Reason at length that agent causality of the metaphysical kind is creative of something outside the being of the agent. So I won't repeat myself here, but recall then that Avicenna has no difficulty distinguishing between what Aquinas would call ens or esse commune, the collection of all created being, and the creator. There's no confusion between those as far as Avicenna is concerned, because ens commune or esse commune in the Arabic it would be something such as aniya mutlaq or huwiya mutlaq or wujud mutlaq, absolute being. Then there's no confusion of that notion and the nature of the necessary being, which is pure being, aniya makhta. So both of these thinkers, Aquinas and Avicenna, hold that creative causality, ibda in the Arabic, creare in the Latin, and notice the same language is in the Liber de Causas, so it's not just Avicenna. This language is found, this creative causality is found in the first creating being, though they do differ on the nature of creation. Avicenna thinks that creative causality is also found in the hierarchy of intelligences, since the higher creates the lower ex nihilo from no pre-existing thing, and with a continuing ontological need for existence by the lower from the higher. So that satisfies the criteria for creative causality for Avicenna. and so that satisfies ibda. In Aquinas, in contrast, we find that Aquinas thinks creative causality belongs to the first cause alone, and uses language closer to the notion of creation, uniquely belonging to the first, which we find in the Platiniana Arabica and the Liber de Causas. As I see it, both of the accounts, the Platiniana Arabica and the Liber de Causas, are inadequate to yield the kind of metaphysics that Aquinas needs. That is the notion that God is immediately, not through anything else, but immediately the cause of being in each and every thing. So this, while Aquinas will be using the language of the Liber de Causas and the Platiniana Arabica, which he didn't know directly, rather, as I've said before, he knew only through the Liber de Causas, nevertheless, Aquinas will have to develop a different metaphysic. So all of these three groups hold for the truth of primary causality and trace the existence of all beings, those eternal and those transitory, back to a single primary cause, the first cause. So they are all teaching primary causality. Furthermore, Avicenna teaches very clearly that the act or operation of the first cause is not something different from its essence or being. Again, a teaching in accord with the Platiniana Arabica and the Liber de Causas. But this is also in accord with Thomas Aquinas, who holds that there is no plurality in God, and that God's essence or being and act or operation are one. Exactly how they interpret this teaching, though, is quite different. So, do they have the same doctrine of being and same teachings on the nature of God? Well, I have some questions to raise regarding this, but before proceeding to those, I want to provide a short analysis of a text of Aquinas to emphasize further his use of Avicenna's reasoning. But in the course of analyzing this, I want also to make some remarks about his use of philosophy in theological contexts. Why would I want to do that, this latter, talk about the use of philosophy in theological contexts in Aquinas? Because he is oftentimes said to have held that philosophical reason is constrained and guided by Christian theology. That view is to say that the sword has only one side, when in fact for Aquinas it's a double-edged sword. By that I mean that Aquinas used philosophy to critique Christian theologians, such as Augustine, Bonaventure, and others, and also to expound the philosophical basis for theological doctrines. In this latter case, then, the philosophical account becomes the primary bearer of truth, and the theological statements or theological views are dialectical accounts expressing the truth that philosophy unearths, but they express it in religious language more spiritually and emotively moving for its hearers. There's a similarity here in this matter with what's found in the Islamic philosophers. So let's have a look at the issue of whether being, esse, is properly said of God for Aquinas. And again, I give you the reference here, Book 2, the sentences, Distinction 8, Question 1, Article 1. In the response or solution, Aquinas writes the following: I respond that it should be said that of all the other names, he who is the name of God, proper in the highest degree. The reason for this can be fourfold. 1. The first is taken from the text of the words of Jerome regarding the perfection of divine being. And he continues, for the perfect is that which has nothing outside of it. Our being, however, has something outside of itself, for it lacks something which has already passed by for it, and something which is yet to come. So our being is temporal, and our something has something outside of it. Carry on then. But in divine being nothing has passed, nor is there anything to come. For this reason his whole being is perfect, and on account of this being properly befits him with reference to all other things. A comment here. Note that this number 1 then is based on the term perfection used of divine being by Jerome. And what Aquinas provides is a philosophical explication of the term as used by Jerome. Let's continue with the translation then. The second reason is taken from the words of Damascene, who says that he who is signifies indeterminate being and not what he is. This is because in this life we know of him only that he is and not what he is, except through negation, and we are able to name something only insofar as we are able to know it. For this reason, he is most properly named by us he who is. I comment. Here, too is based on the authority of Damascene and his statement. Like the first, the basis is an opinion by a religious authority, which Aquinas then goes on to explain in somewhat more philosophical terms. 3. The third reason is taken from the words of Dionysius, who says that among all the other divine participations of goodness, such as to live, to understand, and the like, it is first and is as a principle for all the others, having in itself all the others mentioned, united in a certain way. In this way, God is also the divine principle, and all things are one in him. My comment, like the other two, here 3 is based on the view of a religious authority. There is no argumentative reasoning to prove the view or opinion to be true. Rather, Aquinas only explains the accepted opinion from this religious authority. 4. The fourth reason can be taken from the words of Avicenna in his Metaphysics 8.1, which we've studied. Aquinas goes on, in the sense that, since in everything which is, there can be considered its quiddity, through which it subsists in a determinate nature, and its being, in virtue of which it is said that it is an act, then this name thing is imposed on the thing from its quiddity. Right? So it's imposed from the notion of what the thing is, hence its quiddity. And according to Avicenna, this name who is, or being, is imposed from its act of being. I pause for a comment here, but there's more to come. Although the full argumentative basis in Avicenna is not provided here, this account is very different because it is based on philosophical reasoning and argument. That is, it's very different not from Avicenna, but rather from what we've seen previously in the solution of this article of Aquinas. So here the foundation is philosophical. And of course, Avicenna does not talk about God as he who is, because Avicenna is not drawing on Exodus, the way Aquinas and his other sources are drawing here. But here Aquinas draws on the philosophical reasoning of Avicenna to explain the doctrine. He goes on, then, since, however, it is the case that in any created being its essence differs from its being, which is Avicenna, that thing is properly denominated by its quiddity and not by the act of being, as human by humanity. That's also Avicenna. However, in God, his very being is his quiddity, again Avicenna, and for this reason the name taken from being names him properly and is his proper name, just as the proper name of a human being which is taken from its quiddity. All right, and so there's no difference between God's quiddity and God's existence for Avicenna. So consequently, when we name God for his quiddity. So it's appropriate to name God as necesse esse, necessary being, wajib al-wujud, and also notions of wujud, macht, absolute being as well in some sense, but pure being in that sense, which we've seen Avicenna do. So here Aquinas refers directly to the arguments of Avicenna for God as pure being, who does not have a quiddity different from that being. So, here are my questions for you to ponder. First, how does Aquinas proceed in the solutio of this article? And 2, how should we analyze the reasoning in the solutio with respect to its argumentative foundations? These I'll provide responses to, but we'll have more questions later on for the discussion period. Number 1, the 3 theological opinions or dialectical explanations at 1 through 3 are followed by a philosophical argument grounding the existence of God in the principles and reasoned account of Avicenna. 2. Aquinas refers to Avicenna's demonstration of the nature of the first cause and its philosophical entailments, which include that God is pure being. Of course, Aquinas identifies he who is as being, which Avicenna had not done in precisely the same way. Note this. Here, philosophy is used to provide a naturally reasoned, objective foundation for a theological interpretation. So of the four arguments here, the one that has a foundation in a demonstrative account is the philosophical one. And it serves then to underpin and validate, then in some sense, the three prior theological accounts. Otherwise, we would have remained in the area of theology. Here, philosophy provides the demonstrative account, and theology provides further discussion of it, an explanation of it in the religious context. On the class handout, you have a translation of the first portion of the Solutio of this text. Take a few minutes to read that. In the first book of the sentences, Distinction 8, Question 1, Article 1. This is a different text. Take a few minutes to read that at the beginning of the resumption of class after the break. For completeness' sake, I provide that translation here in the next few slides. If you want time to read what is presented here, you'll have to stop the video for reading, since I'm going to pass over these quickly because my class already has the handout. Also on the handout, you have some more general questions on what we've been studying. And so again, I repeat the things that are on the handout here. I'll go through these rather quickly for the video, because the class has the handout. Again, if you want to take some time to ponder these questions and issues, then stop the video and read the texts. Next class, we will consider the issue of divine agency, obviously a topic we're dealing with, in the tradition of the philosophers of the Arabic tradition. In this case, Al-Farabi and Avicenna would be our primary target, in the critique of them on the issue in the famous Tahafut al-Falasifa, or Incoherence of the Philosophers by Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, one of Islam's most important theologians. As you'll see, Al-Ghazali is a formidable foe in this dialectical work, which has as its purpose the philosophical dismantling of the reasoning of these philosophers and exposing its true character as antithetical to Islam, and in some instances even heretical. And that's it for this class.